Hello, and welcome to another episode of It's a History podcast. I am your host, Madison, and this week I am joined by William W. Campbell. William W. Campbell is a neurologist, writer, artist, philanthropist, and retired U.S. Army colonel whose creative writing career began with short stories about memorable patients encountered over nearly 50 years of medical practice. Today we are going to discuss his most recent release, a historical fiction titled Soldier for the Union, that explores the secret heroism of women who fought in disguise on the front lines of the Civil War. Before we get into the conversation, I just want to let you know that the audio on my end has a slight echo occasionally throughout the episode. I did my best to edit this out, but there is still a few instances where you can hear it. Even with the echo, this was a wonderful conversation. So with that, let's get right into it. Welcome to another episode of It's a History podcast. I am your host, Madison, and I am joined by William Campbell to talk about his most recent release, Soldier for the Union. William, if you want to introduce yourself a little.
Well, my name is William W. Campbell. I guess the W might be important because William Campbell is such a common name. There were three of us in my high school graduating class. It's not quite John Smith, but it's very common. I'm a retired neurologist, retired Army doctor. Spent my career in academic medicine and in the military. Late in my career and early in retirement, began to do creative writing. And that's what I've been doing for the past few years. So that's kind of how I got to here.
Okay. So with your history, being in medicine, being in the Army, I'm assuming that has some sort of inspiration for the book. So where did you get the inspiration to write for this book about the Civil War?
Well, one day I was driving down the road, minding my own business. This was about 5 years ago. And I was listening to a podcast from the Uncivil series by Gimlet Media. And the Uncivil series goes over some unconventional aspects, outlooks, ways to look at the Civil War, things that you don't usually hear. And they played an episode called The Soldiers. And the soldiers discussed all the women who fought disguised as men during the Civil War. And let me be clear, we're not talking about women working as nurses or spies. We're talking about women fighting as frontline infantry and cavalry and artillery. These were heroic women who took up arms to fight for or against their country. There's very thorough documentation of at least 250 of these cases in a book written by a woman who is a custodian of 19th century Army records at the National Archives. So she was in the perfect job to track down some of the documentation of these women soldiers. She and a co-author published a book called They Fought Like Demons, which goes into detail about 250 of these soldiers that they were able to track down. This was about 25 years ago, nearly, when she wrote the book. And historians at the time were estimating probably 400 women, but that was only on the Union side because so many of the Confederate records were burned in Richmond at the end of the war. So we went from, well, they said maybe 400, but all Union. And now subsequent historians estimate now about 1,000 women fought on both sides. So it was not an inconsequential number. And as they went through this podcast episode, the soldiers, they talked about how many of these women had their identities discovered when they got injured and had to go to the medical tent, at which point the medical personnel would discover this is not a dude. As an Army doc, this is a story that needs to be told. So I wrote the story. It's the story of a woman soldier, but it is told through the eyes of a battlefield medical unit. That has only rarely been done. The only time that I really know of that it's been done is MASH. You can look on this as MASH without the comedy, because there's no comedy in here. It's analogous in the sense that MASH is a story about a battlefield medical unit. So it's the story of this woman soldier and of the people in this medical unit, including a surgeon and his nurse, and there's a romantic element between the surgeon and the nurse. So it's kind of a war story and a love story told in the carnage of what's called the Overland Campaign, which was in the spring of 1864 when Grant tried to march directly from north of the Rapidan down to Richmond. They had tried to capture Richmond before by going up the peninsula. McClellan did that, and that just didn't turn out well at all. So Grant decided he was going to go directly overland, 100 miles between D.C. and Richmond. So that's called the Overland Campaign. It was these bloody battles, the Wilderness, the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse, the Battle of Cold Harbor. And if you look at the top 10 bloodiest battles of the Civil War, those three will invariably be on that list. It was horrendous. At one point, I have a character describing the numbers to lions, actually. And it was like a first bull run every day for a month. 40,000 some odd casualties in 30 days. It was bad. It was really bad. Yeah. And I think people don't really understand how bad, how brutal the war was, because sometimes it gets romanticized. And we talk about troop movements and battles, and you got the red squares and the blue squares. So it's this dispassionate look at things from a military perspective. What I try to look at is the human cost of war. A lot of my writing, this is not the only thing that I write. I have a Substack as well, but my focus is on the human cost of war. And that's what this book is about. It's about the moral dilemma that faces the regimental hospital deciding what to do with the woman soldier that they have discovered, and then how the war is impacting all the characters who are on the cadre of the regimental hospital.
Reading the numbers of 40,000 people or 700 people died in this battle, but when you're reading a book and you're in the story and you can see the amount of people that are affected, it does make it more personal, more human. A lot of the books that I've covered on this podcast so far are these human storybooks where we are with the people. It's not an overview, it's more with them. And I really appreciate that look, because it does make these people who less than 200 years ago that were fighting for one cause or the other. I really appreciate that perspective of it. So for this book, a lot of research had to go into it about the Civil War, where troops were going, the battle plan was. What did that research look like for you?
Well, one of the most interesting aspects of my research I have to share. I knew that I needed to educate myself about Civil War medicine, because that was going to be a huge piece of it. I wanted to talk about Civil War medicine in a very realistic way, not in this Hollywood. The Hollywood depicts the Civil War surgeons as being a bunch of drunken butchers, and nothing could be further from the truth. I wanted to depict the Civil War medicine aspects of it realistically. So I decided I would try to educate myself about Civil War medicine. I have to take you back briefly to 1968, at which point I am a third-year medical student at the end of my internal medicine rotation, about to have my final oral examination. And I find myself sitting at the desk of the department chair. We're in Augusta, Georgia. The department chair is a guy who came down from New York and graced us with his presence for the better part of a decade, and then went back to New York. His name was Alfred J. Bolett. Bolett was a beloved figure, a master clinician, somebody that everybody had utmost admiration and respect for. Dr. Bolett was quizzing me about something, and my knowledge base was insufficient. I'll never forget how poorly I felt I was performing on that oral exam. I wasn't doing as bad as I thought I was doing, but I sure felt like I was doing bad. So that's who Now, I go to educate myself about the Civil War, so I go looking for textbooks on the Civil War. So what pops up? Civil War Medicine, Challenges and Triumphs by Alfred J. Bolett. So it turns out that not only is he, master physician, the height of his profession, academic department chair. I think he might have gone to Lenox Hill in New York after he left Augusta. He went back to New York, but he was still in academic medicine, the pinnacle of achievement in his field. Then he had a side gig as an expert on Civil War medicine. He's written a bunch of stuff. There's an organization called the Society of Civil War Surgeons, and he was like, board of directors of that society. He was a major figure in the Civil War medicine community. He wrote this book. I talk about that as being lessons from the ether, because I'm still learning from my old chief, but I'm learning from him through the ether. As I was reading that book, I felt some connection back through all these decades to my former chief. I have a YouTube video where I talk about lessons from the ether and my relationship with Dr. Bolett. That was a big part of it, and that part of it was really enjoyable, really special. In terms of other research, the problem with writing about something like Civil War, I'm sure it's the same for World War II, there's just such a vast amount of stuff to be known. It reminds me of the quote about the poet A.E. Housman, who said in a lecture, The sum of things to be known is inexhaustible, and no matter how long we read, we will never come to the end of our storybook. And that's the way it is with the Civil War. Shelby Foote wrote these books and formed his trilogy, these tomes, these huge things are 600 or 700 pages a piece. And there's just so many aspects to the Civil War that you just never dream of. I mean, the Civil War battles taking place in Arizona and Colorado and places, the Civil War extended to the coast of France. There was a notorious Civil War raider called the Alabama who terrorized Union shipping on the high seas, and she was tracked down by the USS Kearsarge and sunk off Cherbourg, right off the coast of France. Who knew, for instance, that Kit Carson, this mythical figure of the Old West, was in fact a Union Army colonel who was involved in an atrocity of war. He was a commanding officer in a thing called the Long Walk of the Navajo, where they decided, this thing all got mixed up with the, Indian wars of the time and this kind of stuff. And they decided they were going to move this huge group of Navajo from one place to another place, couple hundred anyway, miles, I guess. And it was similar to the Trail of Tears in the mortality. Union soldiers were murdering people who couldn't keep up, the sick, the infirm, the people who couldn't, and they fell out on the side of the road and were murdered by Union soldiers. Kit Carson was in command of that unit. Who knew that? Who knew that? But you can go on and on and on down these rabbit holes. And the problem is that at a certain point, you have to stop doing research and start writing, because I could just sit and read about the Civil War all day. Is that compelling? Is that interesting? There's so much stuff.
Yeah. Trying to find that spot where you're like, okay, I've got a good baseline. Now I just have to center it in and find where I want to be.
And I have to give a shout out to Wikipedia, because there's a tendency for people to want to try to look down their nose. It's very fashionable to criticize Wikipedia as a national treasure, particularly when you're writing about this kind of stuff. Because if you look up on Wikipedia, the Battle of the Wilderness, it has all the troop movements and so forth to tell you exactly what happened. But then they also have what they call the order of battle. And you cannot find this anywhere else. You can go to Britannica and beat your head against the wall. You're never going to find this. I don't know where you would have to go to find this, but the order of battle is the units that were involved in a particular battle. If you're reading about Battle of the Wilderness, it'll have Union order of battle, Confederate order of battle. You click on Union order of battle, it lists all the units that were involved, the commanders of those units, sometimes like the first sergeants of those units. So you can track down where I'm writing my story from the perspective of the 116th Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry. Their commander changed a couple of times. Well, their commander didn't, but their corps commander did. Their division commander did. So I had to keep an eye out for the order of battle to be sure that I've got the right commander at the right time. The commander of the 116th didn't change. It was a guy named St. Clair Mulholland. The people above him did change. So I had to constantly be aware of those kinds of shifts. What division, you want to get it right, but not overdo it. That's a very fine line to walk, because you overdo it and people say, oh, you're just writing a history book. I tried not to just write a history book, but the history is part of the story. It's so compelling. What was going on militarily during that overland campaign has a direct bearing on what's going on with the characters in the story.
Yep, they're linked. You can't separate them. To tell the story of the characters, you have to tell the story of the Civil War, at least during the time period that you're talking about. You have to include that information for the story to make sense and to be complete.
I think you do. I read somebody was talking about the different ways that you can write historical fiction. One being kind of Hilary Mantel style, where you go into deep detail and you have absolutely everything correct. You're impulsive about historical accuracy. How many Booker Prizes did Hilary Mantel win? Starting with Wolf Hall. So there's that style. And then there's another style where you tell your story and you throw in some words and phrases that are period appropriate to create the setting of whatever historical period that you're writing about. but you don't go delving deeply into the history. So there's these two contrasting ways that you can do it, and it's a spectrum. I'm on that spectrum closer to the Hilary Mantel end of it, but certainly never. She was a person apart from the rest of us mortal authors. That's kind of the way I approached it. I wanted to get the history right because one of my beta readers, a woman who's traditionally published 4 novels, said at one point, and I hope that she's correct, this book will find its way into college classrooms. And nothing would please me more than for some upper level American history course to be talking about this novel because it covers so many aspects of the Civil War that are not covered anywhere else.
Yeah. When I was in college, we read a couple of books similar to that, rooted in the history, but they were historical fictions, but the history was true. And it was, like I said earlier, a more approachable way for us to get ourselves into it. Because history can seem daunting to a lot of people, especially when they think it's just dates, names,
Right.
just random trivia facts. But it's people. You have to be able to see the people side of it to really understand the history. And books like this with the historical fiction are a really good entry point for people who maybe are a little daunted to start looking into history if they've not done it before, or they want to look into a new sect of history. It's a really good entry point to get somebody into the space.
Yeah, absolutely. And no better example than The Killer Angels. Have you read The Killer Angels?
I haven't, but I will jot that down so I can take it.
A book for the ages. So it was written by a guy named Michael Shara, and it's about the Battle of Gettysburg. I read that book. I knew the basic overview of what happened at Gettysburg, but Killer Angels was an amazing book where he goes back and forth, Union side, Confederate side, what was going on with these guys, what was going on with those guys. So much intimate detail about the relationships between Robert E. Lee and James Longstreet. Who was really responsible for Pickett's charge? Did Longstreet drag his feet? All kinds of stuff that you're going to be hard-pressed to get just from reading a dry recitation of the Battle of Gettysburg. It brought the Battle of Gettysburg to life. And I remember the history was so detailed, I thought I was reading a nonfiction book. I remember some poor bookseller in an airport bookstore. I was cruising through looking for something to read on my airplane trip, looking at the fiction section, and I see Killer Angels in the fiction section. I went to the bookstore, I was like, what the hell do you have Killer Angels in fiction? Well, not fiction. This is real stuff. This really happened. Turns out, if you look at the cover, it says Killer Angels, the classic novel of the Civil War. So even Michael Shara realized, but basically he had to fill in. He didn't have detailed records of the conversations, for instance, between Lee and Longstreet, as they were talking about Pickett's charge. And he didn't have the detailed documentation of those conversations. So he kind of had to fill in what he thinks they might have said to each other. So there's a fictionalized aspect to this history, but the history is there. It's one of those books that leaves a mark, one of those books that you never forget.
I'll definitely seek that one out, see if I can look at the library, if I can grab a copy.
Yeah, but it's a great example of how you can use fiction, fictionalized aspects sort of to bring history to life in a way that makes you remember. I can tell you a lot about the Battle of Gettysburg from having read Killer Angels that I would never have been able to tell you just from reading the usual dry account written by a PhD historian.
And the academic speak. So, all right. So this leads us into talking about the book itself with our main character, Lion, who is a disguised soldier, and her interactions with a surgeon, Jonathan, Sarah, even her interactions with her brother that she enlisted with. So if we can, kind of talk about her a little bit and what her story is.
Well, let me first say that the name Lions was used in honor of an actual woman soldier whose name was Sarah Rosetta Wakeman, and she fought under the name Lyons Wakeman in the 153rd New York Volunteer Infantry and died of dysentery in New Orleans at the age of 22. She was one of our heroic distaff soldiers. A book was written about her called An Uncommon Soldier by Lauren Cook. and it contains letters. It's maybe the only, as far as I know, it's still the only firsthand account from one of these woman soldiers. It's a collection of the letters that she wrote home. It paints a picture of what it was like to be in the Army. That was a rich source of material. When she wrote home, she was constantly asking for stamps because they had no stamps. Almost every other letter is like at the bottom, P.S., please send stamps. So I incorporated some of that into the book. My character, Lyons, writes home and asks for stamps. Lyons Wakeman, the real Lyons, also had premonition that she wasn't going to survive the war. So premonitions play into the novel a bit. So my Lyons also, as she writes home, voiced some of these same premonitions. If I don't make it home, I will see you on the other side, kind of thing. So I incorporated some of the stuff from The Uncommon Soldier as I created the Lyons character. Lyons Wakeman, interestingly, did not set out to join the Army. She was trying to escape from what I call the prison of womanhood, because life was so constraining for women in the 19th century. She wanted more out of that. She wanted some independence and some freedom and make a little money. So she puts on pants and joins a riverboat crew. She's working as a crew member on a riverboat on the Ohio River. As the riverboat pulls into some docking place, there's a recruiting crew there from the Union Army. Recruiters are out in the countryside trying to persuade people to enlist. And she runs into these recruiters and they persuade her, hey, we got this nice bonus. The bonuses were pretty significant. So they paid her a nice bonus. She sent part of that home. That's how she wound up in the Army. She didn't set out to join the Army. She set out to get herself a little bit of freedom from the constraints on her life as a 19th century woman. That's who Lyons, the character, is based on. A lot of what happened to Lyons, the actual individual, is reflected in the book. Lyons, the character, joins with her brother, which was common. The women soldiers oftentimes joined with brothers, boyfriends, fathers, husbands. Relatively few joined all by themselves. They usually went with some man. Lyons joins with her brother, and things become difficult. And stuff happens. It is the Civil War. One of the themes of the story is grief, particularly complex grief. And how is complex grief different from ordinary grief? My surgeon, Jonathan, is also dealing with some of the same issues because he lost his wife. He shares that with Lyons because they both have lost a loved one and feeling responsible for that loss, both of them. That's another of the themes that runs through the book. Lyons joins with her brother and fights heroically. There's very graphic battle scenes, Battle of Fredericksburg, particularly Chancellorsville, and I'll cover some of these past battles too. It's not all overland campaign. Lyons fights heroic. She winds up wounded in the medical tent, and a lot of this comes out what her war experiences have been up until that time and some of the horrors that she's seen. Headless horseman. She's dealing with a lot of stuff. She has PTSD. I try to paint that picture because the PTSD that happened in the Civil War is no different than the PTSD that happened in Vietnam. It's the same condition. Herodotus described the psychological trauma of war in Greek warriors 3,000 years ago. Don't pin me down on the date, okay, but shall we say millennia ago. So there has been writing about the psychological trauma of combat going back ages and ages and ages. And there's actually a really good book that looks at a particular unit. It's a Union Army unit. It covers what they call the long reach of the war. They looked at a bunch of Union Army veterans who are in a mental hospital. The case that they make is this PTSD. These are the same symptoms that we associate with PTSD that we recognize in current, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, any war. It's all the same condition. They call it shell shock in World War I. They call it battle fatigue in World War II. They renamed it PTSD after Vietnam. It's all the same thing. She's suffering from these symptoms that we recognize as being part of that syndrome. That's going on. There's this grief thing going on. But in the midst of all of it, these characters support each other. They support each other because they're all going through stuff. It's kind of another theme is the human connections that sustain us in our darkest hours.
When Jonathan and Sarah, they have their connection. You can see how it's not just like a coworker bond. It's kind of almost a familial type of bond between everyone in the medical tent. You can see in their conversations that they do care about each other, especially if they're doing something difficult or just the day-to-day of how hard and heavy everything that they're doing is. There's check-ins, they see how everyone's doing, and it is that humanity piece of it, caring for each other even in hard times. One of the things in your book that you tackle with multiple different perspectives is everyone's different reaction to finding out that Lyons is a woman and what they should do with that information. There are some people who to send her home immediately, others who are like, let's get her back on the field. She's one of the best soldiers we have. I think we should go into that a little bit and just how the different perspectives of her being there in that situation, how they came to be.
So there are a lot of different angles that come into play. Commanders had no playbook when they encountered a woman soldier. There was nothing. I mean, who had any idea? The military regulations at the time had no provision for what do you do when you find a woman fighting in the ranks of your company. So sometimes women were sent home. Sometimes they were put in jail. Sometimes they were turned into cooks or forced to perform some other kind of domestic duty. So there was not one thing that happened, but a number of them did, in fact, get put into the brig. The problem with just ordering a woman to go home, because we know that this happened, you order a woman to go home and she's not interested in going home. She's committed to the fight. She's going to stay in the fight. So she walks 5 miles down the road, joins another unit, makes up a different name. They had no records. There were no computers back then. They couldn't cross-check. So that happened. A woman gets kicked out of one unit, goes and joins another unit. The surgeon knows that that could happen. He wants Lyons to decide to go home on her own because then he thinks she'll go home and not just join another unit. Whereas the people that want her to be turned into the command are not necessarily thinking, oh, the command may tell her to do this, but she may not do what the command told her to do. But that's kind of a way out of their dilemma, is to turn her into the command and let the command deal with it. Eventually, it's a moment of betrayal in the book that involves those kinds of decisions and the unpredictability of what might happen when you turn the woman into the command. They may not tell her to go home because it's well documented that some commanders put the women back into the fight.
Reading the different perspectives, even with Lyon's own perspective, like she wants to stay, she wants to still fight. It's something that I like seeing the different ways that people think about it, even during this time period. Not maybe what a woman should do, but a woman can do, what her abilities actually are. Yes, we don't usually see women in this area. We don't see them fighting on the battlefield, but women did do that. Women were there. They were doing it. It is something that they were capable of doing and are capable of doing. That we didn't stop being capable of doing that. And
no, we have firm documentation of women in combat dating back to the 14th century. And then there's the less firm but likely things that went on. For instance, the Greek writings right after Homer depict a woman soldier fighting in the Trojan War. She was fictionalized, so it's a myth, right? Mulan is a myth, right? But are those myths just made out of thin air? A lot of fiction is based on fact, you know? Yeah. And these myths go back thousands of years. So how long have women really been in combat? Probably before the 14th century. We just don't have the documentation of it. And in World War II, I'm listening to the Tom Hanks series World War II right now. We were just listening last night about the Battle of Stalingrad. And I didn't realize how many Russian women fought in the ranks as they were trying to defeat Hitler.
It's always, especially like being in school, like growing up, going to, K through 12, then college. It's not something that we talk about a whole lot, and this is something that we come about usually after college on our own. It's just not something that's included in the courses, and I wish we were a little bit more honest with our history as we're growing up. This shouldn't be something that you wait until you're older to know. It's something that we should be highlighting. Like, yes, women have been fighting in wars for hundreds, thousands of years.
Right.
And they
Have you ever read, I'm sorry to interrupt you,
Oh,
but,
you're good.
but have you ever read Lies My Teacher Told Me?
No, I have not.
So here's your second reading assignment besides Killer Angels. And that's a book called Lies My Teacher Told Me. And it has to do with exactly what you're talking about. All the stuff that we learned in school that just ain't so, you know? So that's exactly what we're talking about.
Is there anything else with Lion's story that you want to cover before we go?
No, just the fact that she's struggling. She's trying to get better. She seeks out counseling. She goes and talks to a chaplain named William Corby, who later became president of Notre Dame. So she goes and talks to Father Corby about her nightmares and her poor sleep and her recurring memories and flashbacks. So she actually recognizes that something is amiss with her in the head, and she goes to try to get some help. And Dr. Corby, Father Corby, does his best, but his best then was say some Hail Marys and pray the rosary and that kind of thing. Not that treating PTSD is easy now, but the methods that they might have had then. Say again?
You work with the information you have. You don't know what you don't know until you learn.
Exactly. It's just like they didn't have antibiotics at the time of the Civil War. Psychology hadn't even been invented yet. Concepts like the stress of combat, stress wasn't a thing. It took William James, and I don't know exactly when William James came along, early 19th century, before psychology became an accepted area of study into human behavior. So no, they did not have those tools any more than they had antibiotics.
I really enjoy reading this book. So I think if you're interested in Civil War history, that you will also enjoy reading this book. Bill, where can listeners find you and the book?
Okay, the book's available everywhere books are sold. It may not necessarily be in the brick and mortar bookstores, but anywhere online, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, bookshop.org for independent booksellers, so you can buy it there. There's further information on my website. It's kind of a convoluted website domain name, but it was necessary, like as I told you before, about all the William Campbells there are in the world. I'm also an artist, so the website is williamcampbellauthorartist.com. So you can go there and read more about this novel and about some of the other things that I've written, not necessarily Civil War stuff. I also started a Substack to talk about Civil War history, Civil War medicine, as well as some literary stuff. The Substack is called Civil War Dispatches. So if you search for Substack Civil War Dispatches, it should take you right there. There's posts that I've written about women in combat and treatment of yellow fever, different things that are relevant to the Civil War era. A lot of it is Civil War medicine. Some of it is like a day in the Civil War history sort of stuff. So those are places that you can read further if you're interested.
Thank you for coming on today. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I will definitely link the book in the description below. I will also include your website and the Substack in there, so if anyone wants to easily click onto that, they can. Thank you again for coming on.
Well, thank you for having me. Enjoyed it.
Thank you again to William Campbell for coming on to the show and talking about his book, Soldier for the Union. As mentioned, I have Bill's website and Substack linked in the description, as well as a link to the book itself. Thank you for listening to this week's episode. If you liked what you heard, head over to Spotify or Apple Podcasts and leave a review. If you have any questions, comments, or topic ideas, you can email me at itsahistorypodcast@gmail.com. You can also find me over on Instagram and Threads at It's a History Podcast. Thank you again for listening to this week's episode, and I hope to have you in the next one.